So welcome to our discussion. It's Larry Berger and myself, Serge Pringle. We are going to each talk a little bit and then start the discussion. And at some point, we're going to invite you to share your questions or comments to enrich the discussion. Larry and I have talked quite a bit about this topic, and we have both a lot of things in common, which makes a discussion possible, and differences, which makes a discussion interesting. So this is not a debate in the sense of trying to win a debate or win an argument. This is a way to first continue the kind of discussion that he and I have been enjoying and sharing it with other people, with the hope that what it does is hearing some arguments, hearing the way we each think, trying to delineate some positions, some similarities, and a lot of differences, will actually stimulate you in articulating how you feel about this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to give the mic to Larry.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Serge. I really appreciate being here. And I'm grateful to you for putting together this session on this very rich topic. Now, we're supposed to be representing different perspectives, but I think Serge would agree that these positions are very close. Now, he seeks meaning by living in the moment, And I think meaning is ultimately about how we fit in the grand scheme of things. These things are not incompatible. In fact, I'd argue that staying in the moment, or mindfulness, is how we connect with something higher. So they're very much related. Another way to think about the two perspectives is in the relation between Eastern and Western philosophy. I assume most of you are well acquainted with Eastern, but perhaps not so much with Western philosophy. My focus is on how that can help us understand why mindfulness can open us to the divine. Although the truth of this is hardly apparent in today's chaotic world. But we here know the truth. And because we experience it, I believe it's our duty to our fellows, particularly in these perilous times, to try to educate them. That's what Western philosophy offers. A way to provide reasons for why things are the way they are. We need spiritual leadership. And I think philosophy can help. The approach I think is most promising is that offered by phenomenology, with thinkers such as Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Husserl is famous for what he calls the epoché, or the bracketing of beliefs about the ultimate nature of things. So we can focus on how life actually takes place from moment to moment, which sounds a lot like Serge's perspective. And Husserl's famous student, Martin Heidegger, is, in my view, the ultimate spiritual philosopher, even though lots of people see him as an atheist and a Nazi. Mindfulness is very important for Heidegger, and he attracted a lot of interest from Eastern philosophers because his approach can be more convincing to those who prefer to think for themselves rather than relying on authorities. Now, one thing that Heidegger argues is that we belong here. We are not accidentally placed in the cosmos, although Serge may differ a bit on this issue. One way to argue this is that the universe produces and sustains us, so we're already part of something greater than ourselves. My approach is to define mindfulness as acute and sustained attentiveness, and define attention as our presence in the world. Our presence. So as such, attention transcends any dichotomy between self and world because we're in the world. We're ecstatic is the term that Heidegger uses. So yeah, we transcend any dichotomy, mental or physical, self or world. The point is that we're not stuck in our minds. There's no wall between us. There's no barrier between us and the world, but rather the core, the very core of our being is spiritual. It moves freely from our lived bodies to the outer. So I argue that the core of our being, that presence is spiritual. It's an invisible presence in the world. So we're not reduced to something physical. We're more like beams of light. And who's to say that we don't belong here then? Because what would the cosmos be like without light? In fact, my own view is that attention is the divine spark. So this position resonates with Meister Eckhart and Judaic thought, among many others. Now, attention is very important in our daily lives and in many academic disciplines. So my approach is to argue that it is how we experience anything at all. And that when we gather our attention, which is the essence of mindfulness, a real space opens. This is not just an experience, right? Just in our minds. No, we're in the world, we're real. And when we hold open a space, we hold space, we clear a space, that is a real event. That's what Heidegger calls a being event, okay? And what that enables, the political implications are large. People talk about public space in political philosophy. So if we hold open this real space, that's where the core of a community, that's our core, that joins in that space. We can bond together and therefore pursue visions of the common good. That's why, in my view, so many groups are forming where people engage in mindfulness to deal with trauma, community issues, or just to connect on a deeper level with others. I think that's our best hope to prepare for a difficult future. We're stronger when we bond together to work for the common good. So I thank you, and I'll turn it back to Serge.
Thanks, Larry. So the different perspective, almost literally, is, for me, the difference between looking from the top down versus looking from the bottom up. And I'm a therapist, and like many therapists these days, have been very influenced by trauma-informed perspectives, which themselves have had a lot to do with all the research in neuroscience, in evolutionary psychology, and the phrase top-down versus bottom-up is one that we use a lot in my milieu, to make the difference between psychology as traditional psychology was in the past, with a sense of human exceptionalism, a sense of the cognition being driving what it's like to be a human being. And in contrast, the top-down version is how there's a continuity between other animal forms and us, and how essentially a lot of how we function has to do with simple, implicit, unconscious processes. And essentially that's the top-down part. And it's not about a question of saying it's all top-down as opposed to all bottom-up, but simply recognizing the importance of the top-down, the bottom-up versus the top-down. And so from that place, it's, as a therapist, you really don't just use ideas in abstraction, but you practice them because, when you see clients and you work with them, essentially the perspective you have is something that is used moment by moment to make sense of what's happening. So the perspective that I'm suggesting in terms of philosophy and spirituality is more of that bottom-up perspective, which is that a lot of the way we make sense is not something that is at an intellectual level in a top-down way, in agitating ideas and trying to make sense of them in some kind of intellectual way. But essentially, a lot of the making sense is something that happens implicitly, unconsciously in our body. That our body, and I include the brain in the body. I'm not making a distinction between body and mind. I'm just using the whole organism. So I'm using body as opposed to simply talking about the brain alone or the mind alone, the psyche alone, trying to make sense of the world. But a lot of what happens is essentially that our organism, as all living organisms, interacts with the world. Everything is interaction. And in that interaction, basically, much of the interaction, if not most of it, is something that happens at an unconscious implicit level. So a great example of that is, say, you take a sunflower and the sunflower orients with the sun, and it doesn't need a mind and it doesn't need a willpower to do that. And so a lot of our functioning is something that has these kinds of bottom-up processes. And what we have with the brain is we have the ability to actually go further than that and to complement the information that we get through these processes. And a lot of what also we do with the brain is have access to these processes, that the brain essentially monitors the information that we get through our senses and derives from that a sense of being in the world. So, I'm not going to talk much more because we're going to discuss, it's going to be an exchange of ideas between Larry and me. But I wanted to first, articulate that the big difference is one of perspective, of saying that, when I think about philosophy or spirituality, I think of it as something that is essentially something that is pretty much something that is automatically gathered, derived from our being in the world, and that a lot of it is for us to become aware of what's happening implicitly. And once we do, of course, it doesn't mean we take it for granted. Of course, like, for instance, if we just simply took for granted our senses, we'd think the world is flat. So we do have, some paying attention to other sources of knowledge in order to balance that. But I'm saying that a rich foundation for understanding our place in the world, whether from a philosophical point of view or a spiritual point of view, is derived from paying attention to what is happening implicitly in our body through these bottom-up processes. And so just switch back to Larry.
Well, I'm going to have to, reconnoiter. I mean, that was quite a profound statement, Serge. And it's funny, we have not touched on this issue at all yet. And I think it's crazy, really, that you brought this notion up, top down versus bottom up. I'm writing a book on all this, and that's exactly what I'm working on right now. I'm working on, and what I'm engaged in is a debate between Dan Zahavi, who's one of the most prominent thinkers in phenomenology, and Martin Heidegger. And I'm going to argue that Zahavi is one of the top Husserl interpreters in the world. So it really is a debate between Husserl and Heidegger, who I mentioned earlier. But I'm going to argue that Zahavi puts forward a bottom-up perspective. And I'm arguing that fails in philosophy. That position fails because it fails in physics. Okay, physics, the idea there is to find those elementary particles and build it up. That doesn't work. Okay, because when they go to the quantum level, they have no idea what's going on. They don't know what the physical is, the physicists, because when they dig deep to find those fundamental particles, all they find is things that violate the Newtonian laws. They find that everything's entangled, everything's related. You talk about we interact with the environment. Okay, well,
I just wanted to
geez.
say, I love you.
Yeah, so it fails in physics. It fails in mathematics because mathematics cannot be complete by Gödel's theorem. Okay, so what Heidegger offers is a relational holism that incorporates everything you're talking about. I think it incorporates relationality. You talk about an organism and the body, brain interacting with the world. That all fits, but we need more. Now, and I think you're getting to that by saying, well, we need these perspectives. But in order to understand our world, I think, best, we can't build up with these structures to get to some vision of the top. And that's really what I think stands in the way of more openness to spirituality in the world. We think that everything can be explained by components. Attention is described as a mechanism, a brain mechanism. That's how people understand attention in philosophy, because they've got that in science. I'm saying this pervades our whole, the way science is understood. Okay. It's understood as a simple brain mechanism, and it's not a unified phenomenon. Whereas in fact, from the perspective that we live, from the phenomenological, the whole picture perspective, the top down, if you will, attention is what unifies us. We are scattered. We live our lives scattered, dispersed, immersed in worldly activity. But if we were to gather ourselves and become whole, so I think we aspire to become whole. Attention can do that. So we get the exact opposite picture regarding what attention is when we understand that we can gather ourselves. That's what we want to do in the world. Again, I agree, I love everything you talk about is going to the implicit. And of course, we're both fellow Gendlin admirers. So I'm full, and Gendlin is all about coming to a whole understanding of our situation, right? That's what the felt sense is. It's we understand our situation, we move toward that to try to come to that, articulate it. So this is just, we have not scratched the surface here. I just want to say, because I agree with everything you said, Serge, but so that just shows that there's a lot of fertile area here. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. So you're pointing out that we run into a wall if what we try to do is reduce everything to understandable material components, or essentially if we try to make sense of the world the same way that we would say take an engine apart and set aside all the pieces, and from there derive an understanding of how cars work. And I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about separating things to find an understanding in separating little units. I think, when you mentioned the felt sense and you mentioned Gendlin, what Gendlin found is the notion of this felt sense as giving us, human beings, a perception of the situation as a whole. So I think that what neuroscience has done is essentially confirm that insight, that through the bottom-up processes, our body, our organism, our brain perceive the world and essentially start articulating a response to it that is an implicit response, an unconscious response. And as we are in touch with the felt sense of it, essentially, we are connected to that implicit response of the body to the situation outside. So that is not a unit by unit description of the situation, of how we respond to it. It's actually a great simplification. One of the things that we are really becoming more familiar with the brain, with the mind is essentially something that is oriented toward making decisions. The mind, the brain did not evolve to be a study group trying to write some kind of a white paper on the meaning of things, but it's action oriented. You know, people talk about the predictive ability of the brain. So the function of the mind is, in any given situation, to identify the most likely successful response to that situation. And fortunately, most of the time it works, but it works essentially best in those situations that are more similar to the situation in which we evolved our current capacity. And when we're faced with situations that are of a different order, that are more complex, like situations in civilized life, often these predictions are not really necessarily accurate because they correspond to a different environment. So I'm digressing a little bit here, but the point I was trying to make is that what our functioning through the mind is essentially trying to have a predictive ability, which is simplifying things. You don't want 15 options. You don't want 3. You don't want 2. You just want 1. You know, move forward, go away. You know, and obviously we have more options when the situation is safer. But the more intense the situation is, the more of a danger there is, the more of a narrowing of choices, the more it's one thing. So essentially, there is a profoundly unifying quality to what we get from these bottom-up processes. And that's a situation that, overly simplified in order to permit action right in the moment. And so, in fact, I'm not talking about, analyzing or cutting down in pieces, but I'm talking about connecting to that, incredibly clear, super simplified reaction that we get from the bottom-up processes, being in touch with it, and then being able, through mindful thinking, to complement it. But the base of the foundation of how we orient ourselves in the world is that biological way of responding in a bottom-up way. So just back to you, Larry.
Well, what you described there is exactly, in my parlance, how we attend to the world. There are various possibilities that we have, and depending on how emotionally charged they are, that definitely gets us to focus on whatever is needed. So I couldn't agree with you more about that whole intricate body work that exists and that guides us, and in making our path in the world. Okay, so we're certainly 100% clear there. But again, my perspective, your perspective is more, like I say, therapeutic. But what I'm looking for is, how do we explain this to others? And again, getting back to that question of meaning, where do we find the meaning in our lives? Okay, we're all on a quest, right? And we're we're in difficult times. So how do we explain to people what the promise is of all this? That's what I think the role of philosophy is that we have this intricate network, the body environment generally calls it, okay, that has tremendous intelligence. Okay, but we're out of touch with it. We're obviously not living lives very intelligently, right? So we have this vast intelligence that you're talking about. We have to just get in touch with it, yeah. But how do we explain to others the need for this? And I think we have to ask the question of what's attention, because I think that's really what you were getting at there. You were saying that you were talking about the very process of living in the world, and we live through. And by the way, this is Heidegger through and through. Being in Time, 1927. It's all about we're oriented to the future. You know, that's the temporality. Being in time is there are not just static entities out there. We evolve, we unfold over time, and the human being is oriented toward possibilities for being ourselves. So we're beings in a whole cosmos of being. I mean, it's hard to really explain, but it's such a simple notion, being. But Heidegger's 102 volumes are about being. We are beings, and we're in a larger situation. Being is a cosmic phenomenon, and that's where the meaning comes from. Okay, because why should we do all this? Why does all this stuff work? Well, Heidegger says, you know, it's not that they're component parts building up the cosmos. That fails. So where's the answer then? Well, how do we explain to people what this intricacy is in which we live? Because it's not physics. Okay, there's no way to build it. How do we explain it? We have to start with where we are in the cosmos. It's either that or a holism. So this is really a way to argue for a holism that's the source of meaning. Because attention is intimate in Heidegger, and I have an article called "Attention as a Way to Being" that is designed for Heidegger scholars. But being and the divine are intimately related. So attention, a way to being, is a way of saying in Heideggerese, attention is the path to the divine. So gives us the global understanding that I think complements your approach. And I was going to say, you know, as usual, you know, you're saying top down versus bottom up. You want to go bottom up. I say they interact. They're very important, both. And it's the relation between the two. And again, it's relationality. That's rock bottom. It's not component parts. We're part of a whole, and all the entities within that whole are related to one another. He has an essay called Identity and Difference, that we have this gathering that can unite us all, but we're all individual, separate, but related. And like I said, I think that's a way to understand the global situation better.
Yeah. So obviously, you know, there's a lot of overlap in what we talk about, and you were just talking about being, meaning, being, and also about attention. And I would like to suggest, you know, at least from my perspective, I see notions like being and attention as being as two extremes, two sides of a continuum, you know, that I'm making up, not trying to say that in some kind of a logical way they belong at extreme, but I am hearing them as two sides on a continuum. And when you talk about being or you talk about meaning, I think of it as large questions about how do we, you know, kind of almost not quite metaphysical, but very large questions, and that open the door to traditional philosophical inquiries or spiritual inquiries. Who are we? Where are we going? What's the meaning of life? Attention, on the other hand, you know, at the other end of this spectrum that I'm just creating for the purpose of this moment, you know, attention is really focused in the moment. attention does not exist outside of the moment. And so in a way, the reason I'm creating this continuum line is to say, when I am interested in questions of being or of meaning, I'm noticing that what happens in myself is a shift into a more intellectual mode. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I love discussing intellectual questions. I'm not making a point about, intellectual is bad, but it's a different mode. I go into, talking about ideas. When I shift more toward the pole of attention, its attention is not something that exists, in abstraction. Attention is, I am paying attention to something. It's very concrete. It's very much in the moment. And so when I am in the moment paying attention to something, I have a different experience of myself. When I'm in the more intellectual mode of paying attention to what is it like to what is being or what is meaning, I am more up here. And when I am paying attention, I'm more grounded. My body is slowing down. There's more breath. There's more bandwidth of really noticing little nuances of moment by moment experience. I'm more focused on experience as opposed to thoughts. And of course, there is an interweaving. I mean, that's what makes us human. That's what makes, this kind of thinking very wonderful and productive. But I'm just highlighting what I see as a difference between both. And I'm curious to see what your perspective on that would be.
Yeah, well, I totally understand what you're saying about thinking about being in the abstract would lead you to just intellectual, being brought up into the head and not being in the body. But Heidegger is well aware of this. And again, I'm saying that, he actually has a quote from Parmenides that he actually thought about over the course of his career. And in the end, there's a book called What is Called Thinking, where he says thinking is attention. Okay. And the quote from Parmenides is basically attention and being are the same. Thinking and being are the same, but he equates thinking with attention. So they are the same. This notion of being is, he's overcoming the entire metaphysical tradition. One of the great things he does is he goes through the whole history. He has a whole history of metaphysics. And that would lead you down this path of ending up being just intellectual and not really getting to the thing itself. And one key way to think about this, how do we relate them? Well, Heidegger, in his second magnum opus, he had this Being in Time in 1927, which just put him on the world map. But he had another much more, esoteric work in 1936 called Contributions to Philosophy. And on that first page, he says, I want to speak from my being, not about it. In other words, I don't want to, we're not here to intellectualize. We want to be in that body, speak from the depths of our being. That's how we overcome metaphysics. So you're equating the quest with being rightly with the metaphysical tradition. It's been an idea bounced around forever. But Heidegger comes from a spiritual perspective and a pragmatic, get it done, living in the world kind of idea. He's our friend, is what I'm trying to tell you here. But this key idea is speaking from. Then we're not being metaphysical because we're speaking from the body. We're staying, well, Jen tells us, we stay in the body and we speak from the sense. And then we try to further articulate the intricacy of our lives and how we feel in our situations. And let me tell you that Genlin was a Heidegger scholar, and he got his best reception from Heidegger scholars as a philosopher. So they're very closely aligned.
Yeah. So the convergence is that sense of speaking from experience as opposed to about experience. And speaking from experience, of course, experience is embodied, it's not an abstraction. So speaking from experience also means speaking, being in touch, from being in touch with the body, from being in touch with embodied thinking. And from that place, there is less, if any, difference between thinking and paying attention. And in fact, that whole notion of contemplative thinking is really a sense of allowing.
Mm.
So that thinking is not necessarily cutting down into pieces, but it can be really the sense of staying with, contemplating, and letting the awareness come from our implicit processes instead of just from abstract constructions. And so where the convergence is, is we're talking about philosophy or spirituality in a sense of making sense of the world. And so what we're articulating is the notion of being in the world, of being with our felt sense of being in the world, of allowing the sense to form, and of letting it inform us. And from that, there is an emergence of making sense and an emergence of meaning as a felt sense, not meaning as an intellectual construct, but an emergence of meaning as something that comes from being with the world, being with ourselves, and allowing that sense to emerge.
Well, that's the answer. No more to say.
This is part of the Active Pause podcast. To see more and subscribe to the newsletter, go to activepause.com.